Jazakullahu Khairun Mufti Saab for that very relevant lecture. Alhamdulillah, studying under Mufti Saab, we really enjoy certain aspects about his class. And one thing we really enjoy is how relevant he makes the lessons. Every time we read a hadith, he takes out these points from subtle points that we wouldn't have recognized if we were reading it ourselves. About how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to deal with each other, how they used to act with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how they themselves were human as well. And so we look at these points and we realize that we can also implement these things in our lives. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the tawfiq. As Mufti Saab was mentioning, that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was such a personality that he revived the deen in all different aspects, in terms of da'wah, politically, as well as in terms of ilm as well, right? And he's such a person that the sha'ir, the poet says, حَلَفَ الزَّمَانُ لَيَأْتِيَنَّ بِمِثْلِهِ حَنَثَتْ يَمِينُكِ يَا زَمَانُ فَكَفِّرِي. So I'm not going to be able to translate it because it's hard to translate poetry, but I'm just going to explain to you what he's saying. He's saying that he's talking to time. He's saying, "Oh time, you swore that you will bring somebody the likes of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, but you have broken your oath, so pay your kafara." Because after Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, there has been nobody who has come, no mujaddid who has come, who has done what Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was able to do in all the different facets of life. But somebody who came close, and somebody we may all know, even non-Muslims know, and even non-Muslims attest to his greatness, is Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah. And inshallah, our very own Mawlana Shibly Rahaman will be speaking about him, restoring honor. His topic is restoring honor, the heroism of Salahuddin Ayyubi. And just a little bit about Mawlana Shibly. Mawlana Shibly Rahaman was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, where he completed the memorization of the Quran. From a young age, his interactions with people of different religious backgrounds helped him cultivate an interest in studying Aqidah, which ultimately led him to pursue studies in South Africa in Darul Uloom Azadville, where he completed a 6-year Alamiya program. Thereafter, he also embarked on studies in Darul Ifta al-Mahmudiyya, and he finished 1 year of the Ifta course as well. And mashallah, he is a master in Aqidah, and also he's well grounded in history as well. Inshallah, so we invite him forward to come speak about Salahuddin Ayyubi.
Jazakallahu Khair. Nahmadu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My respected elders, my beloved students, colleagues, youngsters, my beloved community, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, mashallah, we've been listening to the bayans, the lectures of our respected scholars, who I consider not just my colleagues, but my teachers as well. And I must say, and I know that you must hear this a lot from people who sit, on the podium, but I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a mubayyin, I'm a humble student, and what I came here to do is simply share my notes, some of what I have picked up, some historical facts with you, in the hope that I can first implement the lessons which can be gleaned from these facts into my life, and perhaps that you can benefit as well. Now, I've prepared a small presentation to help guide us through the points that are going to be mentioned. Now, the subject matter, the personality that we're going to be speaking about is Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah. And Salahuddin Ayyubi is, I'm quite sure that he is in no need of introduction. The entire Muslim world knows who he is. But normally when we understand Salahuddin Ayyubi, when we read about his stories, when we read about his life, when we read about, or whether you read any of the authoritative texts on his life, we read him in isolation of the background in which he lived and the predecessors which gave rise to the eminent figure of Salahuddin Ayyubi. So I feel that it's important to put things into perspective, and before we actually start delving into Salahuddin Ayyubi himself, I think it is necessary to understand the history of Jerusalem, the history of the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem rather. So let us begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, what is the historical backdrop of Jerusalem? Number one, when did Jerusalem first come into Muslim hands? It was during the conquest, the Khilafat of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. After that, it stayed in Muslim hands for a period of approximately 400 years until it passed to the hands of the Seljuk Empire and the Fatimiyya. Anyone's heard of the Fatimiyya, the Fatimids? It's not a very common name. But they were a Ismaili Shia dynasty that happened to rule over much of North Africa early in Islamic history. And then after that, Imam Zinki becomes relevant because he was the first to try to push back the Crusaders which took Jerusalem from the Fatimiyya. And after him, his son Nuruddin Zinki, and then our own Salahuddin Ayyubi. So let's begin with the history of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Umar radiallahu anhu and the events leading up to the siege of Jerusalem. So as we know, the Khalifa before Umar radiallahu anhu was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. For the initial duration of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's reign, he was preoccupied with what's known as the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. And the Wars of Apostasy were a series of events in which tribes around the Hijaz region, what's modern-day Saudi Arabia, rebelled against the central Khilafat in Medina after the demise of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So there were people who paid lip service to Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and as soon as Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was gone from the scene, they decided to take advantage and break away from the Khilafat. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, being a very strong ruler, he put an end to the apostates, and in a period of 10 days, he reunited the Muslim Empire, or what was of the Muslim Empire at that time. And normally, it's understood that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, because he was preoccupied with the wars of apostasy, not many conquests were made during his Khilafat, which is not true. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, after dealing with the apostates, what did he do? He turned his attention towards Persia. And before Persia, he actually turned his attention to modern-day Iraq. He conquered Iraq and laid the foundations for the conquest of Persia, which was to be completed during the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu. And he sent forces to Syria to start the invasion of the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Byzantium. And after Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu passed away, after his glorious 2-year reign, Umar radiallahu anhu took up the reins of the Khilafat, and he continued the policy of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu with the Byzantines, and he continued to encroach onto Byzantine territory. Now, as a response, what happened? Emperor Heraclius, he was the ruler of the Byzantines at that time. He launched a counter-offensive to regain these territories, but was decisively defeated by Umar radiallahu anhu in 636. The Heraclius launches a counter-offensive and he is decisively defeated. After that, the Byzantines would no longer encroach on Muslim lands. After the defeat of Heraclius, the commander of the Muslim forces in Syria, he was appointed by by Umar radiallahu anhu, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiallahu anhu. He held a war council to discuss what would be the next step of the Muslims, where should the Muslims move next. And Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu, being a master strategist, understood that there were 2 cities that needed to be conquered, either Jerusalem or Caesarea. And after making mashwara, consulting the leading Muslim generals, he received a letter from Umar radiallahu anhu ordering him to march on Jerusalem. So Umar radiallahu issues the command to march on Jerusalem, and Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu immediately sends a force, Muslim force from Syria to Jerusalem, led by no other than Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu. So Muslims led by Khalid advance on Jerusalem. And in the meantime, Byzantines, they received news and they braced themselves for the siege. So they started preparing themselves. However, the Byzantines were now isolated. They had no help coming from anybody else because Heraclius' forces were already defeated. Moving on, let's begin with the commencement of the siege itself. Muslims, instead of launching a number or a flurry of assaults on Jerusalem, they decided to camp around the city and wait out the siege. They decided to starve Jerusalem of its resources until they were forced to surrender to the Muslims. The underlying tactic for this was Umar radiallahu anhu didn't want to shed blood in the holy city of Jerusalem. He didn't want even non-Muslim blood being spilt in the place where 70,000 prophets are reported to have been buried. After about 4 months, the Christians sue for peace. The Patriarch of Jerusalem at that time, he was the major priest appointed by the Byzantine emperor. His name was Sophronius, and he offered peace terms, but he said that I will only pay the jizya and agree to surrender Jerusalem on the condition that the Khalif himself comes to negotiate that treaty. I only trust Umar radiallahu anhu. And they believe that Umar radiallahu anhu was actually mentioned in their scriptures, in the Bible. And they believe that Umar radiallahu anhu was a man that the Patriarch was meant to surrender Jerusalem to. Now what Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah told Khalid bin Walid, that we don't have time to call Umar radiallahu anhu all the way from Medina. We need the city right now. So they decided that why not just send Khalid bin Walid. Khalid bin Walid went, and some historians mention that because Khalid bin Walid resembled Umar radiallahu anhu greatly, it was hoped that they could be convinced into thinking that this was Umar radiallahu anhu. But then eventually they decided, no, we have to call Umar radiallahu anhu himself. Umar radiallahu anhu packed his horse and he made for Jerusalem. We all know the famous story that upon reaching Jerusalem, he was aided by his slave. And Umar radiallahu anhu, being a just man, he would also give his slave a turn on the camel. So that, sorry, it was a horse or a camel? Camel, yes. So that the slave would also get a chance to sit upon the camel. And Umar radiallahu anhu would walk for a certain duration, and then they would take turns. When it was time to actually reach Jerusalem, it was a slave's chance to sit on the camel. And upon seeing the two individuals, Umar radiallahu anhu and his slave, they thought that Umar radiallahu anhu must have been the slave because he was the one sitting on the camel. So they all rushed forward to meet Umar radiallahu anhu, but then they realized that this was actually his slave. Anyhow, Umar radiallahu anhu was brought to the Patriarch Sophronius. And Sophronius said that I surrender Jerusalem to you, and we agreed to pay the jizya. And Umar radiallahu anhu signed what's called the pact, the Umriya pact. The Umriya pact, or Al-Uhdud al-Umriya, was the famous treaty signed by Umar radiallahu anhu, in which the transfer of Jerusalem was peacefully made to the Muslims, and Umar radiallahu anhu granted the civil rights of every single inhabitant of Jerusalem, whether he be a Christian or Jew. And there are many variations of Al-Uhdud al-Umriya. Now historians differ with regards to the authenticity of the actual text, but we do know that such a text once existed. So the Patriarch of Jerusalem places conditions and Jerusalem is surrendered. Now how did the surrender of Jerusalem take place? Umar arrives in Jerusalem in 637 AD. And the famous Umriya Pact, as we discussed, was signed, and the Jews returned to Jerusalem after 500 years. Now, there is a famous Israeli historian, and his name was Moshe Gil. And Moshe Gil, what he writes, he's an Israeli historian, he wrote that after 500 years of oppressive Roman rule, the Jews were allowed to freely return to Jerusalem and pray in their holy land under the rule of the Muslims. This is a testimony from the mouth of a Jewish historian himself, one of the most eminent Jewish historians in Israel. And after they returned, the city of Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and it passed down from dynasty to dynasties, Muslim dynasties, and for 500 years it remained in their hands, and until it passed on to a dynasty called the Seljuk Empire. Now who were the Seljuks? The Seljuks were a group of descendants, a tribe that were descended from the Turks of Central Asia. And the Turks lived in Central Asia for thousands of years as nomads. And they were known for being very tough and for being like a warrior-like race. And the Abbasids, anyone heard of the Abbasids? Abbasis? The Abbasis were the dynasty that took power after the Umayyas. The Umayyas were the dynasty that took power after the Rashidun Caliphs themselves. So the Abbasis, they were descendants of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's uncle, Abbas radiallahu anhu. They employed the services and the talents and the military expertise of the Turkish people of Central Asia from the 9th century onwards. And as time passed, these Turks became Islamized. They adopted the Islamic religion and culture, and they mass migrated into Islamic cities. And within a few centuries, they emerged as powerful states, numerous states. The most famous amongst them at that time were a tribe called the Seljuks. They were the most powerful Seljuk state, Turkish state. And they soon began establishing their own empire. And it is said that they built a stable state from Syria to Central Asia. And by this time, the Abbasis were simply figureheads. They no longer wielded real power. The Seljuks were the acting power of the Muslims at that time. Although they ruled in the name of the Abbasis, and they portrayed themselves as the protectors of the Abbasi Khilafat. Now, in 1071, the Seljuks wrested the major city of Manzikert from the Byzantines. They made an assault on the Byzantines and they took a major city from them. And the Byzantine emperor of that time, Alexius, he implored his Western rival, Pope Urban II, for help, saying that I don't stand a chance against these Muslim Turks by myself. Send your forces, let the Christian world unite after centuries of rivalry, the eastern and western halves, and let's put an end to these Seljuk Turks. Now what did Pope Urban II do? He rallied hundreds of disgruntled peasants and knights not to help Alexios, but with the intention of conquering Jerusalem. So with his fiery speeches, he traveled Europe and he started to galvanize peasants and knights to form an army. And by the year 1097, Urban II's forces mobilized and poured out of Europe in a frenzied and religious zeal. And along the way to Constantinople, where Pope Alexius was based, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, they massacred Jews and any other Christians which did not belong to their denomination, their Catholic denomination. Their stories became so notorious that by the time they had reached the gates of Constantinople, Emperor Alexius, he ordered that the doors be closed. That I've heard of your treachery, I've heard of the massacres that you have committed on innocent people. I can't let you in for fear of you plundering and looting my own city, your own fellow Christians. So what did Pope Urban II order? He ordered the Crusaders to move towards the Seljuk Empire, the heart of the Seljuk Empire, the Principality of Antioch. So the Seljuks conquer Manzikert. Emperor Alexius implores Pope Urban II for help. Urban rallies an army to go to Jerusalem, and instead of going to Jerusalem, they first march on to Antioch and they capture it. Now, after only a week's siege, they conquered Antioch and they massacred most of its inhabitants. And the remaining inhabitants they turned into slaves. And from there, after the Seljuks were dealt with, they decided to move on to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at that time was temporarily in the hands of the Fatimiyya. Jerusalem was always the center of a tug of war between the Sunni Hanafi Seljuks and the Ismaili Shia Fatimiyya. Now, who were the Fatimiyya? A little bit of background history. The Fatimiyya were descendants of a man who called himself Ubaidah al-Mahdi. Ubaidah al-Mahdi because he claimed that he was the Mahdi promised by Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they're called Fatimiyya because he claimed to be a descendant of Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, hence a Sayyid. Now, historians have differed, and it's a bit controversial. The famous historian Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah, he's of the opinion that this claim was legitimate, and they were indeed the descendants of Fatima radiallahu anha, but they were deviant Muslims. However, a latter historian, Mawlana Akbar Shah Najib Abadi, the author of the famous book History of Islam into 3 volumes, he differs with Ibn Khaldun, and he says that I am astonished that a learned and erudite scholar like Ibn Khaldun would be so naive as to believe this claim. And according to his own research, Mawlana Akbar Shah Najib Abadi rejects this, and he says don't call them Fatimiyya, call them the Ubaidis, because they're not descended from Fatima radiallahu anha, rather they're descended from Ubaidullah. So whatever you want to call it, they're famously known as the Fatimids. Now the Fatimids wrested Jerusalem from the Seljuks recently. Now after dealing with the Seljuks, the Crusaders finally marched on to their final destination, what they were waiting for, Jerusalem. And after only a week's siege, what happened was that the Fatimiyya were now just an island. They had no forces coming. The Abbasis were busy, they were just a figurehead. The Seljuks were just recently defeated, there was no one to help them. After a simple week's siege, Jerusalem collapsed. And the Crusaders started to pour into the holy city of Jerusalem. For the first time in 500 years, Jerusalem was back into Christian hands. And its entire population, according to Stanley Lanepool, who wrote the famous book Saladin, and it's considered one of the most popular and authoritative texts on the life of Salahuddin Ayyubi. He mentions that a population of 70,000 Muslims, Jews, and Christians were massacred. Al-Aqsa Masjid was profaned with the blood of the Muslims. The same place where Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam led all the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasallam in Salah, it was now stained with the blood of the Muslims. Jews and traditional Greek, Armenian Christians were considered heretics by the Catholic Christians at that time, were burnt alive in their sepulchres and their synagogues. Pregnant women had their wombs ripped open by crusading soldiers. And in the words of Raymond Aguilers, a crusader during the Crusade of 1099, he revels and he says in almost a type of brutal lust. He's saying, in the temple and the porch of Solomon, meaning Masjid al-Aqsa, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle and reins. And he's saying this with a sort of lust. He's happy to write this. He wrote an eyewitness account of what happened because he partook in that crusade himself. Now, after the Muslims were massacred and they were completely eradicated from Jerusalem, no expected help came, in the form of some united Muslim force for another 40 years. Because the Muslims, the Seljuks were too crippled, the Abbasis were too crippled, the Spanish sultans were too far away. And what happened was that the Crusaders ended up establishing 4 separate kingdoms in and around Jerusalem. So the Crusaders finally mount an assault on Jerusalem. Jerusalem is conquered and it is massacred. Right? So that is the story of Jerusalem right up till the debut of Salahuddin Ayyubi and his predecessors. Now, the first person to actually deal a decisive blow on the Crusaders was not Salahuddin Ayyubi, contrary to popular belief. It was actually Imamuddin Zinki, rahmatullahi alayh. When help finally came, it came not from Baghdad, which was the seat of the Abbasi Empire. It didn't come from Cairo, which was the seat of the Fatimiyya rulers or the Ubaydi rulers. And it didn't come from Damascus as well, which was the then seat of the Seljuk Empire. It came from an unexpected region of the Muslim Empire, from Mosul, Iraq, which wasn't a strategically important place at that time. And it came in the form of Imamuddin Az-Zinki. Now, who was Imamuddin Az-Zinki? Imamuddin Zinki, rahimahullah, he was initially a tutor to the princes of the Seljuk Sultan Mahmud II. He was hired as a teacher to his princes. And after seeing his talent and his talent for politics, the Seljuk Sultan Mahmud II, what he did is that he appointed Imaduddin as the governor of Mosul, and thus establishing the Zinki dynasty. After consolidating power in Syria and Iraq, Imamuddin Zinki, he marched on a place called Edessa, which was around Jerusalem. And he had this burning zeal to see Jerusalem and the surrounding areas return to Muslim hands. So the kingdom of Edessa was the strongest fortress of the Crusaders at that time. And Edessa was a base for the Crusaders. They would launch all their attacks and assaults from Edessa. What Imamuddin Zinki rahimahullah did, he captured Edessa in 1144. And this was the first blow against the Crusaders since they set foot in Jerusalem. He was unfortunately assassinated by a slave 2 years later, 1146. And he was the first to strike a devastating defeat on the crusade and on the Crusaders, but his dream was carried on by his illustrious son Nuruddin Zinki. And his illustrious son Nuruddin Zinki took up the task. And Nuruddin Zinki, during the time of his father, was the ruler of Aleppo. And as soon as his father passed away, he took up leadership of his dynasty, and he dealt another few decisive blows against the Christians. He took Egypt and he took back what's called the Julan Heights, the Golan Heights of Syria. Now what happened to the Christians in Jerusalem was that they were surrounded by the Muslims, the Zinki army, on 2 sides in a pincer movement. Egypt on one side and Syria on the other side, and Jerusalem was right in the middle. And now he is poised to launch an assault on Jerusalem. However, Nuruddin Zinki passed away from illness at the young age of 57. Now Nuruddin Zinki, rahimahullah, had this an illustrious student named Salahuddin Ayyubi. And then Salahuddin Ayyubi rose to the ranks of the Zinki army, and he became its effective commander. Now it's a long story how Salahuddin emerged as the most powerful man in that region. But growing up, Salahuddin wasn't much of a privileged person. Nobody could have predicted that he would one day conquer Jerusalem. What happened was that Shirko, his uncle, was the top general of the Zinki army. And in Egypt, you had the Fatimiyya ruler there. They called Nuruddin Zinki for help, saying that help us against the invading crusaders. So Nuruddin Zinki sent his top general Shirko. Shirko went, he ousted the Christians from Egypt. However, the Fatimiyya ruler or vizier at that time, Shawar, after using the help of Nuruddin Zinki, he kicked Shirko out. And in order to kick Shirko out, what did he do? He struck an alliance with the crusaders. And I know it's odd. He struck an alliance with the crusaders and kicked the very same people who helped the crusaders out. Now, 4 years later, what the crusaders did is that they also went back on their words. And they attacked Shawar, the Fatimiyya ruler at that time again. And this time he started crying like a baby and calling for help to Nuruddin Zinki. Nuruddin Zinki again sent his army to help Shawar. This time he sent Shirko, and Shirko routed the Christian army for the second time. But as the hadith goes, لا يلدغ المؤمن من جحر واحد مرتين. Nabi Sallallahu said that a Muslim never gets bitten from the same snake hole twice. They had Shirko executed, right? And from this point onwards, power came into Shirko's hand. However, Shirko, he passed away the following year. And unpredictably, Egypt and Syria and the surrounding regions fell into the lap of Salahuddin. And Ibn Shaddad mentions, the historian, the personal biographer of Salahuddin Ayyubi, says that Salahuddin never imagined himself to be in that position. But finding himself in that position, he understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destined a great task for him. And immediately consolidating power, he took other sections of Egypt back from the Crusaders. He took sections of Palestine and even Yemen. And then he finally, what he did is that he started to mobilize his army for the final conquest of Jerusalem. Before that, however, the king of Jerusalem had a general. His name was Reynald de Chatillon. And Reynald de Chatillon, what he did is that he had this very unhealthy hatred for the Muslims. He swore that I will go and conquer Medina and dig out the camel driver from his grave. Guess who's the camel driver? He said, I will dig out the body of Rasulullah ﷺ and I will mutilate it. When Salahuddin heard this, he got up from his throne in a fervor and he said that, Wallahi, Reynald de Chatillon will die at my hands. After that, Reynald de Chatillon, he launched an assault on innocent Muslim Hujjaj. He killed them all, and rumor has it that he captured Salahuddin's sister. However, historians differ. I think that the more reliable opinion is that Salahuddin's sister was not in that caravan. Salahuddin's sister was actually carted away during that siege. But Christian historians mention that Salahuddin's sister was apparently raped. Allahu A'lam. Salahuddin Ayyubi, when he heard that innocent Hujjaj were killed in his own land, he stood up for a second time in his throne and he took another oath, saying that Wallahi, Reginald de Chatillon will die at my hands. Now, Salahuddin Ayyubi wasn't an impulsive conqueror. He was very strategic. And what he did is that in response to the attack on the Hujjaj, he marched against an area called Tiberias. Tiberias is a stronghold of the Christians. Now, the purpose of his conquest, of his siege on Tiberias, wasn't to conquer it. It was to draw out the king of Jerusalem from his quarters, to draw him into battle. He was trying to get him out. And the strategy worked. Despite the protestations of Rahaman III. Rahaman III was the regent of the king of Jerusalem, the child King Baldwin, and Guy was his successor. So King Guy, what he did is that he, in a fervor, he mobilized a massive army and he started heading for Tiberias. Salahuddin Ayyubi was ready. He had strategically placed a number of archers all over the treacherous desert path towards Tiberias. And he ordered them that continue showering arrows upon them day and night. Now the knights, everyone knows that the knights are heavily armored. The arrows never made a dent. Now what was the purpose of Salahuddin Ayyubi showering these arrows? Psychological warfare. That in the week that it took for them to go from Jerusalem to Tiberias, he wanted to wear them out psychologically and physically. And he ordered his men to light fires in the grassroots plains and strategically blow the wind towards the Crusaders. And he cut off the water supply. So the Crusaders were tired from the constant barrage of arrows. They were thirsty and they were living in a whole haze of smoke. And by the time they actually reached Tiberias, Tiberias is as a lake, instead of preparing for battle against Salahuddin, they started rushing towards the lake. And Stanley Lanepool mentions that numerous people actually died because they were trying to gulp water so fast after a week of being without water. And they were trampled under the oncoming horde behind them. at this moment, Salah ad-Din Ayyubi launched his attack and he completely routed the Christians. This is the Battle of Hittin. The Battle of Hittin took place in 1186. After demolishing the Christians at Hittin, he had King Gi of Jerusalem and his henchmen, Reynald the Shah brought before him in his tent. And during the Arabs of that time, or the Muslims of that time, they had a tradition. In order to promise safety of a person's life, the king would present another king with a glass of iced water in a cup of jewel, like in a jeweled cup. So since Salah ad-Din Ayyubi brought Guy in front of him and gave him this cup, meaning that I grant you amnesty. A king does not kill a king. I will honor you. Then Guy, what he did arrogantly, he didn't drink it. He passed it on to Reynald de Chatillon. And Reynald de Chatillon drank it as a show of arrogance. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi immediately stood up. He said, I gave the cup to King Gi. I didn't give it to you, meaning that I'm not an oath bearer. I'm going to kill you. I promise I'm going to kill you. Then Reynald de Chatillon arrogantly said, I know. Right? I know that it wasn't given to me. And he just looked up like this. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi calmly turned around. He took his sword from Ibn Shaddad who brought it and he sliced Reynald de Chatillon's neck open, thus fulfilling the oath that he took, that indeed Reynald de Chatillon will die at my hands. And then the guards took him out and finished him off outside. Right? It must have been one of the most satisfying moments of Salah ad-Din's life. After that, Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, rahimahullah, he marched on to Jerusalem. After a 5-day siege, Jerusalem surrendered. Balian, the defender of Jerusalem, came out and he said, we will slaughter every single Muslim inside Jerusalem. Right? We won't let you take the city. So then Salah ad-Din said that be practical. Look at my men, look at my army. I have an entire Muslim world united under my banner. Do you honestly think you, an isolated kingdom, can fight against me? Right? Salah ad-Din Ayyubi could have said, kill all the Muslims. Right? But then see what we'll do to you. That's not what he said, because Salah ad-Din Ayyubi valued every single Muslim life. And Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, despite being raised, listening to the stories of the atrocities of the First Crusade, told Balian something which Balian himself said that was unexpected. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi said that I will let all your people go free. Give me 7,000 slaves. Those who can't pay, they will be free. And Balian, he negotiated surrender under these terms. Salah ad-Din marched into Jerusalem and he announced that those who are old and they cannot pay the ransom know that you are free. And then he gave 1,000 slaves to his brother as a gift. And his brother set 1,000 of them free. And then Salah ad-Din Ayyubi said that anyone who marches to the eastern gate is free, and people start running towards the eastern gate. And his brother said whoever marches towards the western gate is free, and they all started running towards the western gate and they were free. And then one of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi's lieutenants came to him and he said that give me 10,000 soldiers. Sorry, give me 10 soldiers. And they gave 10 prisoners. And then Salah ad-Din Ayyubi gave him 10 prisoners. And then he said that I will purchase your freedom for a shoelace. So then the prisoner took off his shoelace and gave it to him and bought his freedom. And then one of the people who were there remarked that, why did you do that for? You could have earned some money. He said that I wanted history to remember that how numerous were the slaves and how cheap they were. And after that, Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, he arranged a safe passage of the Christians who decided to leave Jerusalem. And he, as we all know, he promised them their civil rights, and Jerusalem was again returned to Muslim rule until 1948. And that's a story for another time, what happened in 1948. Now the purpose of this story was not just to have a specific timeline in our minds, but to actually appreciate the character of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi rahimahullah. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Savors of the Islamic Spirit. It's originally written by Sheikh Abu Hassan Ali Nadwi rahimahullah, and it was recently translated by Mufti Abdul Rahman Mangira. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him. The next 2 volumes are still out to be published, but the first volume can be purchased here at Dar es Salaam as well. So I'd just like to read a little bit about the piety of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi rahimahullah before I end off. So Abu Hassan Nadwi rahimahullah writes regarding the benevolence of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi: the forbearance, humanity, magnanimity, and Islamic character that Salah ad-Din exhibited on this occasion is worth hearing from the pen of the Christian biographer, Stanley Lanepool, who acknowledges that the Sultan's kindness of heart had conquered his desire for revenge. He writes, never did Salah ad-Din show himself greater than during his memorable surrender. His guards, commanded by responsible emirs, kept order in every street, and prevented violence and insult, in so much that no ill usage of the Christians was ever heard of. Every exit was in his hands, and a trusty lord was set over David's gate to receive the ransoms as each citizen came forth. Then after describing how the people left the holy city were ransomed, and how Al-Malik Al-Adil, the brother of Sultan, the patriarch and Balian of Iblin, were each allowed to set free 1,000 slaves by Salahuddin. Regarding his courage, Mawlana Abul Hasan al-Nadwi rahimahullah writes, during the siege of Acre, the Sultan was afflicted with boils and spots from his back to his knees, making it difficult for him to come to the table. Still, in this condition, mounting his horse, he rode around the battlefield and spent the whole day inspecting his forces. When Ibn Shaddad, the personal historian and biographer of Salahuddin, asked him how could he bear the pain, Salahuddin replied, "The pain leaves me when I am on horseback." Another time when he was unwell, he pursued the enemy for the whole night. During his illness, says Ibn Shaddad, the Sultan's physician and I were with him in the night. He could not sleep owing to the pain he had. But as the day dawned, he got up and mounted his horse to face the enemy. He sent his sons to the battlefront before allowing others to take the field. I was with the Sultan along with his physician. He spent the whole day on horseback until the armies retired from the battlefield in the evening. The Sultan returned after giving necessary instructions for keeping watch during the night. It is mentioned that Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, he mentioned to Ibn Shaddad that I never wanted to become a king. That's not what I had in mind. He said that as a child, I used to cast longing looks at the scholars and I longed to be in their company. I wanted to become a scholar. And Ibn Shaddad mentioned that Salahuddin had Shafi Mutun, traditional texts of the Shafi madhab memorized. And it is said that whenever the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were mentioned, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah would ensure that everyone sat down to listen to it out of respect. And when they were just about to commence a battle, Sultan Salahuddin would have announcers shouting ahadith along the lines to encourage the people to raise their valor for jihad, to fight against the crusaders. And then Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah passed away at the age of 55, 2 years after he conquered Jerusalem. Sheikh Zahir Mahmood from England says it's as if Allah only brought him into the dunya to complete the task of conquering Jerusalem. 2 years later, he was caught by an illness, and as he was lying down in bed, Ibn Shaddad was with him. They were reciting the Quran, and as the Quran ayah was recited, he said, Sahih, it is true. And he passed away, and he went out into the vicinity of his Rabb. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raise another commander like him amongst us, inshallah. Right? It is said that Jerusalem was first conquered by Umar radiallahu anhu without bloodshed. It was reconquered by Salahuddin Ayyubi with mercy. Now who would conquer Jerusalem for us again? Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.